So we're going to look at a bit more of the book of Nehemiah. I preach through the Bible when it's my turn to preach. We do that systematically, Old and New Testament. We've been looking at the book of Nehemiah. And I want to talk for a moment or two about rules and how you feel about rules. Some of us like rules, and we feel safe with rules. They give us structure, and we find people who don't keep rules difficult. Others of us, like me, slightly rebellious of rules, and there's nothing we enjoy more than breaking rules. If it says do not step on the grass, I will always put one foot just gently there. I know that's worrying some of you and causing anxiety, but we're wired in different ways. Some of us love stability, rigidity, and conformity and structure, and others of us want to rebel against it, and many of us are somewhere in the middle. I did a little bit of research and found it on the internet, so it's got to be true. And these are things that these are laws that you may or may not know about in the UK. So things you can't do in the UK. The 1774 Act of Parliament requires that if you have more than one lunatic in your house, you have to register your premises. So, and I guess a lot of these ones are things that we probably are failing on, and I know many of you have more than one lunatic in your house and you're not registered. You need to be registered with the government if you have more than one lunatic in your house. It is also legal to be annoying in any place other than a library. If you're annoying in a library, it's illegal. How you define annoying, but I wouldn't go into the library and find out. A really, really good law that I suspect we don't keep. If you have a burglar alarm, the 2005 Neighbourhoods and Environment Act requires you give a key and the burglar alarm code to a neighbour who can turn it off if you're on holiday or not in. Did you know that? If you haven't done that, those of you who've got so much in your houses that you need a burglar alarm, if you haven't given the key and a code to somebody else, you're breaking the law. If your neighbour's alarm goes off, I wouldn't recommend going round and saying, did you know you're breaking the law because you haven't given me the code to turn it off? But it's a good law, isn't it? It's a good law, but many of us don't keep it. It is illegal to delay the post. If you speak to your postman and stop them delivering from next door because you're having a chat, you are breaking the law. And there was somebody this morning who volunteered that they make their postman a cup of tea, which I think is slightly weird, don't you? But anyway, it's illegal. You are not allowed to delay a postman. That is illegal. Other things that you shouldn't do. It is illegal, probably, if you're in a pay and display car park, to ask somebody if you could borrow some change. That is deemed as begging under the Vagrancy Act of 1824, and you'll be arrested. Even if you know the person, you cannot ask anyone for change. I know many of you keep this law. This is the Metropolitan Police Act of 1839. It is illegal to carry a ladder on a footpath. It is illegal to place heavy and unsecured objects in open windows that may fall on top of people. This is a strange one. You can look guilty, apparently. According to the law, you can look guilty and nobody can do anything about it unless you're holding a salmon, which is the 1986 Salmon Act, which is about poaching, apparently, that if you are carrying a salmon and you look guilty, you can be arrested simply for holding salmon guiltily. And then, to finish off, a couple that are pertinent for those of us that love dogs. If you are in Daventry, which is not that far from here, it is illegal not to be carrying a poo bag. You can be stopped and searched to see if you're carrying a poo bag. If you're not carrying a poo bag, you can be arrested. And finally, The 1953 Livestock Act says that it is against the law to have a dog that worries sheep. Now, older folks are going, yeah, that's perfectly sensible law. Younger ones are going, well, surely every dog would alarm or cause concern to a sheep. The problem here is the word worry has changed. So in the legal terms, it means to chase, whereas for it, if any of you worry me, it isn't because you're chasing me. It is just because I'm anxious about you. So all of us, in a sense, who have a dog can't go near sheep because it would worry sheep in one sense. And this is the problem with laws. Language changes, situations change, and we can feel that made sense at one point. Or maybe there are laws that make sense, but we didn't realize them. And Christianity has a reputation for being about rules. That is because some people, like us, who are religious, we kind of like rules, and we convey that people need to keep the rules. And so this cartoon is appropriate for lots of people starting out in church. He says, we want to thank you for joining our church. Here is a complimentary copy of our unspoken rules and expectations. If you know what's good for you, I'd have them read by next Sunday. Too often, church feels like there's people watching and you need to get it right. And our expectations are difficult. And it starts out well. We start out with the desire to help people, and as we start out with the desire to help people, we think of things that are good for people to do, and then what happens is the things that we think are good ideas become the way we do things, become rules, become reasons to get angry with people for not conforming and complying with what we want. So we are often like Hank. Hank eventually realized that he was too rigid for beach ministry, and his t-shirt says, no shirt, no shoes, no service. We sometimes are hung up in rules and regulations. Oliver Holmes says, the young man knows the rules, but the old man knows the exceptions. I don't know whether that's true or not. I don't know whether you feel alarmed by that or whether you think, yeah, that's true. We're going to think about the Old Testament rules because, as we looked at earlier, Ezra starts to read them to people and they worship God. And yet for most of us, when we read the Old Testament, we look at Leviticus, which I wouldn't recommend reading. You look at Leviticus or Numbers and you go, oh, I do not understand this at all. And it can be concerning because we think, I can't keep all of this stuff. How do I know what to do? So are the Old Testament rules good or bad? Is there a point to them? Or are they just stuff that's of the past and of no value? So I want to try and unpack that. If you've been following us, you can get all of these on our YouTube channel. You can get all of these on podcasts, wherever you get your podcasts. We've gone through Nehemiah. He's completed the wall. And Ezra, which is the book before, which we looked at a couple of years ago. Now the two merge. And Ezra comes together with Nehemiah. When the 7th month came and the Israelites had settled in their towns, all the people assembled with one accord in the square before the water gate. They told Ezra, the teacher of the law, to bring out the book of the law of Moses. That's probably the first 5 books of the Bible: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. And not the easiest books. Really love bits of Deuteronomy. Exodus is okay. Genesis is great. Paul's working his way through Genesis. Leviticus and Numbers, probably not your bedtime reading. Full of laws and regulations. And we scratch our head and we go, how on earth do I keep all of that? So what is the point? Is Christianity about law? Is it about rules? Or is it about a relationship with God? And how do you balance those two things? Well, let's have a look and see how the Old Testament itself describes the purpose of the law. So in Deuteronomy, we read these words: "These are the commands and decrees and laws of the Lord your God. The Lord your God directed me to teach you to observe in the land that you're crossing the Jordan to possess." As they're in the wandering in the wilderness, they're going to go into the promised land. This is the instruction. What is the purpose of this? So that you and your children and their children after them may honor and obey the Lord God as long as you live, by keeping all his decrees and commands that I give you, so that you may enjoy long life. Hear, Israel, and be careful to obey, so that it may go well with you, and that you may increase greatly in a land flowing with milk and honey, just as the Lord, the God of your ancestors, promised you. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your strength. The purpose of the law was to show them how they could love God. It was a set of guidelines, instructions, rules. And there are different ways in which those things apply, and we're going to try and explain that in a minute. But the whole lot is summed up as the application of the principle of how we love God. So there are principles in the Old Testament about how we say sorry to God, how we acknowledge our failure, how we deal with repentance. There are principles for how we appear to be different and we are distinctive and we stand out for Jesus. And there are mostly principles on what it looks like to please God. But what does God want us to do? What does please God? Well, Jesus helpfully explains and answers all of that when he talks about the law. He says, "So in everything, do to others what you would have them do to you. For this sums up the whole of the Old Testament, the law and the prophets." If you want to understand what Christianity is about, it is not about rules. It is about doing to others how you would like to be treated. And that will create within itself principles and values. And he says elsewhere, an expert in the law tested Jesus with this question: "Teacher, what is the greatest commandment in the law?" And Jesus quotes Deuteronomy, which we've just heard about, which is what they all would have expected him to say. Love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your mind. That's the answer they are expecting. But Jesus carries on. He says this is the first and greatest commandment. Well, they know that. But then he says, "And the second is like it, love your neighbor as yourself." All the law and the prophets hang on these two commandments. So I always feel that rules, if we don't know why they are there, have no value. We have to understand why. Why do you need to tell your neighbor the code for your alarm? It's quite obvious. It's going to go off and annoy everybody. Why do you need to carry a poo bag if you've got a dog? You can carry a poo bag if you haven't got a dog, just for fun if you wish. But why would you need to do that? You see, if you keep the letter of the law, you keep the poo bag in your pocket, because the law only states that you've got to have one. But the purpose of the law is that you pick up the poo. I apologize if this is a little too graphic for this time of night, but it's part of life. And believe you me, there are more graphic laws in the Old Testament than I could have chosen. You see, we can say, well, I keep the law because I keep the poo bag in my pocket. I wouldn't keep poo in your pocket. That's not advisable. You can say, I kept the law because I've got the bag. But if you don't use the bag, you keep the law, but you don't keep the purpose of the law. Do you see what I mean? Actually, the purpose is that you pick up the little present that our dog has left for us, that somebody else doesn't tread in it. Actually, there is an Old Testament command to do that you are to pick up. I won't give you the verse, but it's a wonderful verse that I really enjoyed when I was a teenager, about how you should pick up poo in the camp. Anyway, moving on. The purpose I'm trying, as bluntly as I can get to, is that laws are kept best when we understand why. And when we've lost the reason and we just do it, it becomes pointless. So how do we deal with some of these crazy Old Testament laws? The purpose is that they express our love for God. And Jesus is telling us that the way you love God is to love your neighbor. That you cannot say, I love God, but I don't care for my neighbor. We need to say this again and again. When the Bible talks about loving our neighbor, it doesn't mean that we like them or we feel good about them. They may have left their alarm to go off for hours. It's that we do them good. It's that we do to them how we would like to be treated. We do to others. The command to love is an action, not a feeling. And John tells us in his letters, he says, look, if you say you love God, but you do not love your neighbor, you're a liar. So these two things, love God and love neighbor, are interwoven in a way that all the religious people in the world might try to separate, but you can't. Which is why Paul says the entire law is fulfilled in keeping this one command, love your neighbor as yourself. So how do we look at some scriptures, the principles for pleasing God? Some of the passages are about repentance, some of them about being distinctive, but a lot of them about how to please God. Some of those are about governments and judges and how the law of the land needs to be. Some of them are about relationships, about how we relate interpersonally, and it's important not to confuse those two. And some of them are about what is healthy for us. But we need to understand the purpose. Just to reiterate that little cartoon. He who is without sin cast the first stone, right? Well, I still have the first stone. I just threw the second one at him. You take the law without the purpose, the intention, and the spirit of the law, and you stone people. And we are famous for it as Christians. Because we create the rules. You have to wear a tie, you have to do this, you have to do that. And we need to go back and say, why was this law here? How do I keep that? And legalism is when we apply the letter of the law without love. And the equal danger of legalism is that we believe that we can earn in some way, shape or form God's love. So religious people go, I keep all the rules, I keep all the laws. But because there isn't a care and a love for people, because it's rigid and hurtful. Jesus broke a lot of the rules. He really annoyed the religious people of the days. He encouraged his disciples to eat on a Sabbath, and that really irritated people. He encouraged his disciples to eat and meet with those who were living broken and damaging and wrong lives, and that really annoyed. They said of Jesus, he breaks the law. And he said something really interesting. He said, the law isn't made. It isn't made for God, it's made for us. It is there to help us, not to trap us and to enslave us. But there is value. So we're going to try and work out the value, and we're going to try and work out the pitfalls. Martin Luther King said, it may be true that the law cannot make a man love me, but it can stop him from lynching me. And I think that's pretty important. So how do we look at the laws? If you do go and study Leviticus, here are some principles that you might want to hold on to. So you take a law like this. Here is a law about bringing a meat sacrifice. I don't think any of you have brought meat tonight to church to worship God. And if you did bring meat, whether you brought a chicken or whatever, you're meant to take the chicken breast and you're meant to wave it, which is, I feel disappointing that none of you have brought chicken breast to wave tonight in our worship time. So you are breaking this law of God. You are not offering a wave offering. A wave offering. What a great idea, them just sitting there waving. Well, we asked the question of this kind of law. It says, is this a method of expressing repentance? The idea, of course, is they did. They brought the sacrifice to acknowledge that they knew they had done wrong and it was costly, so they paid a sacrifice. And they waved that as a celebration of God's forgiveness. Now, all of this is fulfilled in Jesus. We have come to the one who has died as a sacrifice for us. You do not need to bring a lamb or a goat or a chicken or a calf to a church to express your repentance. You bring your heart. The sacrifice is being paid, but we bring our heart. So all the laws in the Old Testament that you see that are about how to say sorry, they are fulfilled in Jesus. Here's another law. It says priests must not shave their heads or shave the edges of their beards or cut their bodies. Well, I'm all for not cutting my body, but it may not have escaped your attention that I have shaved my head. Quite regularly I shave my head. As my sons point out to me, I leave little tufty bits just for people to notice, but the intention is to shave my head. And you go, Donald, you're breaking that command. You're a priest and you're shaving your heads. And I say, I'm a Baptist and I believe in the priesthood of all believers. So we're all priests. So quite a few of you have broken this command because there's quite a few shaved heads out there. At least there's certainly a lot of bald ones. So how on earth do we keep laws like that? And this is where we find out, and often it's good to have a bit of commentary, a little bit of advice, people who have studied things that help us understand these things. These are the kind of laws that were about making the people of God clearly different, distinctive. So we asked this kind of law, is this a way of being a distinctive witness? And it was because the priests from the other religions shaved their heads as a way of demonstrating they're a priest. So a little bit like a Buddhist monk. So if I came to church dressed in orange robes, like Hare Krishna monk, and I'd shaved my head, you would go, that's not really very helpful, Donald, because you don't look like a follower of Jesus, you look like a follower of another religion. So I would need to keep that by not wearing orange robes and a bath, robes, bath robe kind of things, which is not my normal dress anyway, so it's all good. So we ask ourselves, how is it still distinctive? Well, the answer is no, because loads of people shave their heads. It isn't anymore a way of setting us apart. So we look for the purpose and we find a similar way of applying it. And we look for different ways of being distinctive. So another one, when you build a new house, make a parapet around your roof. How many of you have got a fence around the top of your roof, a parapet? Well, you're breaking the law. Unless, of course, you've got a balcony, which is okay. But this one tells us why. It says that nobody falls off your roof. Now, if you have a roof that people sit on, then you need to have a guardrail. If you don't have a roof that people sit on, you don't need to. So we ask ourselves, is this about health and safety? It is about health and safety. Are you keeping people safe in any shape or form if you've got a fence around your roof when nobody goes on it? No. So we don't need to apply it, but we do look for the principle of love, and that means that if we have, perhaps we might want to have banisters up our stairs so that people don't fall off our stairs. If we have young children, we might want to have rails on our windows or windows that can be locked. There are all kinds of ways in which we would apply this in a different way today, but we're looking at the same principle. Then we look at other things that talk about anyone who injures his neighbor. There needs to be a justice, there needs to be a comparable punishment, not an escalation, not a worse. And these are some of these laws that are about government. This is about how the nation exercises judgment and justice. And we ask ourselves whether that situation still arises today. And we looked at this a lot more a couple of weeks ago when I talked about turning the other cheek and an eye for an eye, and you can find that on our YouTube channel, on our podcast, Questions of Life, and you can see more about that. there. If a slave has been taken refuge, do not hand them over to their master. Now, this is a law that is radical. It's radical because if you look at any other, which I had to do at Bible college, I can tell you the truth, it's quite dull, but there are other ancient laws, and they do not treat slaves like this. We look at the Old Testament law in the light of Jesus, and we think that's a bit harsh. The Old Testament law was actually written in the light of Egyptian and other Near Eastern laws, which were far more oppressive, where a slave had to be returned and killed, in fact, for running away. So what we have here is where the law in the Old Testament is radically challenging the norm and the culture of that day. It looks difficult for us, but in that day, it looks radically progressive. And so we ask ourselves that, and we then want to follow the direction. And so that's why we're convinced that the Bible outlaws slavery, because in every generation, it was pushing against slavery. So we need to understand the context of the time and what was expected and what normally happened. You shall not set your desire on your neighbor's male or female servant, his ox or his donkey. And my neighbor's donkey I don't desire in any shape or form. So does that mean it doesn't apply for me? Well, it's about relationships. And again, we ask these questions and we apply the principle of love. So, Ezra takes this book out. He's reading these kind of things. He says to all who are able to understand, and they start to listen attentively. Now, you may well have gone to sleep by now. And if I was to read the book of Leviticus, I'm not sure that you would listen attentively. But I am going to read a small part of Deuteronomy. Because for them, it was a way of learning how to love God, and it was a way of how to love our neighbor. And I want to read a little bit to you as the final part of our service, and then that will lead us into prayer and reflection. What does it look like to love God and our neighbor? How might this stuff that was written thousands of years ago still apply to us today? He stands up on a wooden bench and all these people around him, and he preaches it. And this is the first bit. You shall have no other gods before me. And I want to just let you pause for a moment. You go, I ain't got any other gods. But I wonder if there's anything that we trust more than God. Or we copy, or we allow to define our values and our lifestyle and our motivations, or we give the prime of our resources to. I wonder if we're absolutely honest, whether we would say, do you know what? The voice of God is second in my life to the voice of, to the phone, to the friends, to the boss, to the wallet. You shall not make for yourself an image in the form of anything in heaven above or on earth beneath and the waters below. You shall not bow down to them or worship them. You'll recognize these as the 10 Commandments. But I wonder if there's anything we love more than God. And I suspect if you're like me, then you acknowledge that all of us put stuff ahead of God. It becomes more important to us. More important for us to please, conform, obey, go along, have that thing, that idol, that man-made invention. You shall not misuse the name of the Lord your God. What does that mean? It means we don't use God's name as a swear word, as an expletive, as an expression of anger, as an underlining to a statement. And for many of us, that is really hard to undo and to stop. But there is another way in which we misuse the name of God, which is probably actually what this commandment was about, because in reality, in the time it's written, people didn't swear using God's name because they were so terrified they wouldn't do it. So what he's really talking about is something else that we as Christians are very vulnerable to, which is saying, God says this. Where we give a little bit more emphasis or importance to our thinking by saying it's God. Just to make sure nobody ignores us or disagrees with us. Observe the Sabbath by keeping it holy as the Lord your God has commanded you. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work. What an incredible God that he commands us to rest. You see, if everybody keeps these 10 commandments, life is infinitely better for all of us. These aren't rules to restrict, these are values to liberate. These are ways of living that make life better. Do you remember right at the beginning, that all may go well with you? This isn't oppressive. And yet many of us struggle, myself included, to take enough time off and to find the space to think about God. Is there a day that we set aside when we will reflect on him? Maybe it's Sunday. Maybe it's another day of the week. Honor your father and mother as the Lord your God has commanded you. I wonder how we respect and care for the elderly, for the generations above us who we're tempted to dismiss or laugh at or lock away. And the commandments continue, you shall not murder. And of course, most of us will go, well, I don't do that regularly. But then we know that Jesus, looking at this stuff, said it's not the outside, it's not the rule that matters, it's what's going on in the heart. And so he says, look, I don't care whether you've actually killed somebody. If you wish somebody ill because you're angry with them, you are breaking this commandment. You see, Jesus is saying it's not keeping the rules, it's the purpose and the point of the rule that matters. And so we might ask ourselves, who that we know are we so angry with that we will be pleased if something bad happens to them, if they fail? We're secretly happy. Who is it that we've wanted to hurt because we've lashed out with our tongue? And we hoped in that moment that it would upset them. And maybe we regretted it instantly. But where is it that God would say, you're not keeping my values? You shall not commit adultery. Where do we look with lust on those we are not married to? This isn't primarily a commandment for the married. This is a commandment for all of us. Where we look at someone we haven't committed to in faithfulness and we look in lust. You shall not steal. Where are we taking what isn't ours? I don't mean that you go around your neighbours at 3 a.m. and break a window and climb through. I mean when you don't fill in your tax form exactly accurately. When you take something that was lying around and we borrow and forget to return. You shall not give false testimony against your neighbour. This possibly is the one we are failing the most at. We have seen how Catherine has been treated on the internet. Princess of Wales. Because our culture is, let's talk about people on social media. We don't know what is going on in a person's life, but when we comment or pass it on or like, we are bearing false testimony. Whether it's Twitter, whether it's Facebook, whether it's TikTok, whatever it is, when we form opinions or encourage others to form opinions and we don't know what the truth is, we cause irreparable damage. What tragedy for this lady trying to protect her children from the knowledge of her cancer, that she is forced into saying something because the world is talking about her on their phones. What have we done? And I know there are many in this room who have been hurt and damaged by what has been said about us by others. In fact, most of us can probably experience that. So this is a really pertinent one. Where do we pass on information or opinions that we are not certain of? And how would it be if we knew nobody ever talked about us? One of the hardest things, I think, is knowing that people are talking about you. It's horrible, isn't it? And God says, I want to create a world where that never happens. I've got these 10 values that if everybody lived, the world would be greater and better. You should not covet. You set your desire on anything that belongs to your neighbor. Who do we envy? Who do we wish that we had their girlfriend, their job, their house, their clothes, their charisma, their gifts? And all we do is break a relationship and we are eaten away with it. So Ezra opened up this book, and all the people stood up, as we've already heard, and they praised the Lord, and they gave thanks for who God is. They gave thanks for this way of life. They gave thanks that these are the values they wanted to live by. And they responded by bowing down and saying, yes, God, this is how I will live. I will submit to your ways, and I will worship you. So I want to ask this question. Where are we changed by these laws of love? Where is God saying, I want you to listen to my 10 commandments and I want you to respond?